championships. Hear, hear. The teams are in opening proposition Monash A. In opening opposition Kings in A. In closing proposition Alaska A. And in closing opposition TCD Hist A. Your panelists today are Julia, Owen, and I'm Adam. And with all that said, I call upon the Prime Minister to open up the round on the motion that this House would buy countries' votes in international organizations.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that the ideals of the Bretton Woods institutions of a perfect global democracy have fundamentally been proven to have failed in the international community. When democratic values as they stand are neither universally accepted by all sovereign nations, and when we recognise that even those supposedly democratic institutions, such as international conventions, are not being used and are being exploited in realpolitik ways. And we think what we need to recognise here is that the best thing that we can do is to recognise that order, to ensure that the maximum benefits to flow to nations who most need it. What we think in this debate is important to recognise is that the realpolitik of it is that vote buying already occurs on international organisations. China and Japan and bodies like the WUDC and other international treaty bodies have bought votes in the form of development packages. Not only do we think that that is a good thing, particularly for the nations whose votes are bought, we think it is a practice that the West and the world as a whole should embrace and adopt. So what we think in this debate is we think this is a principle debate, first and foremost. We believe this is primarily about international treaty organisations such as the International Whaling Commission more than any other body, because this is where this practice already occurs in some areas and where we think it can be most practically implemented. What we think is that this package, when offered, should be most often in the form of international development assistance packages. We think that is the way that the most good occurs. There are two absolutely fundamental reasons why we believe that this is the right way to go. Firstly, because we think that pure direct democracy is failing, and we've got to ensure right now to balance the system such that the most affected get the most vote on these treaty organisations. And secondly, because we think the practice of vote buying will provide tens of billions of dollars of aid to developing nations that have been left out of international development treaties that have failed to provide them what have been promised. So let's talk about why we think we need to rejig the democratic process in international organisations. The first of these is to recognise that they fail right now, but that it is a practice, that this practice of vote buying is used systematically in many international organisations. The problem we have with that is that many other nations refuse to engage with it on a basis of an unwritten principle that says this shouldn't occur. We think that should be removed so that all nations who care strongly about this can engage on an equal playing field. We point out that there is no way to prevent this practice in a real-world environment because there is no way to explicitly target the motives behind why development packages are given and the votes that occur. And so when all you can do is correlation, you can't stop this. The best thing we can do is to normalise the practice so that all nations that have an interest in this are equally able to justify it to their populations and equally able to engage in this practice. And we think, for example, it's problematic that at the moment only Japan considers itself able to engage in vote buying in the IWC. And nations like Australia and America should feel free to engage in that in order to balance the power in that process. But the second reason is that we think that the principles that these international organisations are built on are not even balanced in the way that the democracy we operate on in our normal lives is actually constructed. Because international treaty organisations and even bodies like the United Nations and the General Assembly operate on a direct democracy system, where every nation votes specifically on single issues at a time. And the problem with that is that it doesn't allow nations that have greater interests to have greater say in how that process works. In our normal democratic societies, when we vote en masse for issues in society at elections every few years, people who are disproportionately affected by single issues will swing their vote entirely to be premised on that issue. And hence they do get disproportionate say that recognises the disproportionate harms that accrue to them. In much the same way as many members of the gay community would have voted on the parties in societies that most supported gay rights, even if they didn't like the economic management of that. We celebrate that. We celebrate it in our domestic societies, and we think that should be balanced in the international society. And the way you do that in a system that is fundamentally about direct votes on single issues is to allow nations that care the most about the issues to help persuade other nations financially and to buy their votes when necessary. We point out that on the International Whaling Committee, there are landlocked Saharan African nations that have equal votes on the committee to Japan and other seafaring nations that actually practice whaling. Their interests are not the same. Their interests are not equal. And the best way to balance that, I'll take you in a sec, is to allow nations that are disproportionately affected to buy votes in ways that do that. And we think it's worth noting, I'll take you in a minute, is that the only people who will sell these votes at the end of the day are the ones who don't have a direct interest in this. Poorer nations won't sell when they will be hurt by the actions and the policies that they put in. We think you have to trust governments at some point to be able to look out for the interests of their people.
I'm glad that you've said this in the interesting world of whaling, but what I really want to know is, don't you think that all of humanity have an interest in keeping whales safe generally and allowing Japan and the USA to buy up those votes? Don't you think that will corrupt the system?
Actually, sir, we don't. We think that humanity has a right to determine how it uses the natural resources of the world, and the best way to do that is to ensure that those who are most affected by not being able to use that resource are the ones who have the most say in how that resource is used. And we think nations that have a long-term interest in doing it might point out that the most likely outcome of Japan accelerating this and breaking deadlock is simply that they'll formalise the process instead of using scientific whaling and introduce real quotas that won't change the status quo. But the second big part of this debate is really about recognising the benefits to the developing nations. We think nations should conceptualise their votes on international communities as a natural resource that they have in exactly the same way as they have been blessed or gifted with natural resources in any other way. And as such, we believe that the principal moral obligation of nations should be to use that resource and to use that vote in a way that best advances the needs and interests of their people and of their population. That is key here. And we think that the most likely outcome in many cases is actually not necessarily to radically change the way that policies are made, but to lead to a fight between rich countries trying to buy the votes of poorer countries. And you know what? We think that is fantastic. We think the most likely outcome is that billions and billions and billions of dollars of development aid will be poured into poorer nations in an attempt to buy their votes in fighting over that. And that's fantastic. When the international community, despite hundreds of binding treaties, has never been able to get beyond 0.2% of GDP from the rich world going into development, and when the bottom billion are still stuck in poverty traps. We think that developing nations should see their vote as a resource and should use it in whatever way they can to advance the interests of their nation. And if the best way that they can advance the interests of their nation on an issue that they don't care particularly strongly about is to bring in aid for their country, to bring in dollars for their country, then that is the moral choice to be made. That is the principal choice that lifts people out of poverty. And that's why we think this matters. Look, the ideal system of a principled direct democracy is not only flawed in principle because it doesn't allow those disproportionately affected to have a bigger vote, which we accept in domestic democracy around the world. It also is necessary to tap into this resource to provide development for those who most desperately need it. Thank you.
I thank the Prime Minister and now invite up the Leader of Opposition to continue the round.
Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Wow. They have really hit on the key issues of today by looking at the International Whaling Commission. I'm tremendously excited to argue this case. Fortunately, they said it was a principled case, and then they talked about the International Whaling Commission. So, you know what, I'll talk about it in a principled fashion as well. And I'll also deal with the International Whaling Commission. But we also say, ladies and gentlemen, that actually, if you want to look at whales, we say that is a microcosm of the bigger issue here, of the bigger debate, which is about diversity and how everybody has a say and a role in diversity in our world, ladies and gentlemen. Everyone has a say and a role in the kind of resources that we can use and we should use and how we should utilise them. And everybody cares about the whales, ladies and gentlemen, and their fate. Because you know what? Biodiversity is a global thing and it's a global issue. And therefore, as a result, everyone should have a say in it. It doesn't matter if Victor asserts that they don't care about these issues. We think that it is a pure assertion, and we think that they do. We were told that we have to recognise its realpolitik, and we don't have to give up and assume that it already happens. Well, we think it's good to fight for an ideal, ladies and gentlemen. We think it's good to fight for something that we can improve on and work on, and not just give in to these kinds of things. So we're going to talk about three things in opening opposition. First of all, we're going to look at money for influence and all sorts of practical and principal problems that arise from that. And secondly, we're going to look at the negative impacts that occurs in these countries as a result of this proposition, including these development packages that they want to bring in. And the third thing, ladies and gentlemen, is we want to look at the positive case for why sovereignty is good and respecting the dignity of these countries is good, rather than trying to buy them off and entrenching the interests of the Western world, which we think is hugely problematic in their particular case. So, and most of my rebuttal will be interweaved between them. So, let's look at this, ladies and gentlemen, money for influence thing. Well, we say, as you know, you want to give them development packages and all the rest of it, but we see two problems with this. First of all, problem one, which is practical, and we break this up into three areas, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, we say that A, they will more likely prioritise short-term interest over long-term interest when these kinds of things are being pursued. They will take the money and not consider the structural changes that will occur as a result of this. We think that that's hugely problematic. They'll see the money as a short-term solution to a short-term problem and not look at the long-term ends and the practical problems that result in their influence in the system. No thanks. We say it leads to a loss of expertise and experience of government, of being able to go into multilateral agreements and talk about these things through, ladies and gentlemen. Why? Because their votes will just be bought off. What's the point in going in and talking to those guys? We'll talk to the guys who are buying their votes instead. They will lose ability, even if it's just in the IWC, they will lose ability across the board, ladies and gentlemen, for dealing with multinational organisations and dealing with countries within them, because they'll lose the expertise of diplomacy. Why have diplomacy when someone else can buy your votes? No thanks. We say, see, ladies and gentlemen, that the loss of stature arising from this, these countries are taking money for votes. Think about the loss of stature that will arise, think of the reputational damage that will arise, and how this will reflect badly on them, even in other international organisations, beyond the IWC, which you've already recognised as a principal case, so we presume we can extend this to all international organisations. No thanks. So we think that that's problematic. And we think that effectively what you do is you turn them into satellite states who are with super boats that are going towards other people, ladies and gentlemen. We think that that's hugely problematic. Lastly, on the practical issues, we think that very often the most practical benefits from these international organisations come from informal talks, come from the backroom chats that you have with people, and all of those kinds of things. We think that this is less likely to occur where the votes are simply bought up by people. That's why, in direct rebuttal, giving them development packages like this can be extremely damaging in the practical term. But principally, ladies and gentlemen, so we're moving on to part two, we think that the dignity of these countries will be affected. It's not their fault that they're poor, and we don't think that we should just give them money in this kind of way because we think it represents their interests. Even if they're not poor, so they point to Middle East countries, we think we still affect their identity, their sovereignty, and their dignity on the international stage. And principally, we find that abhorrent. We find it abhorrent that China do it now, as they point out, and we find it abhorrent that they want to make this something that we do on a regular basis. Madam.
So can you, for the first time in your speech, explain to us how the West could possibly counter the overriding interest and influence that countries like China and Japan already enjoy?
Yeah, they should sanction them for doing these things that they shouldn't be doing. They should encourage these countries to stand up to these people. We should counter the development packages with development packages that don't have strings attached to them. There are plenty of things we can do other than just allowing China to set the policy first, and we don't think that that's acceptable. No thanks. Let's look at the negative impacts, so this is point two, in these countries themselves. So we think this is hugely problematic, and it makes us culpable in these situations. Sure, China's in there giving those aid packages, as you point out. They're also helping to prop up patronized systems, ladies and gentlemen. They reinforce this idea that the corrupting elite in many of these countries can continue to buy every level of society down. We find this dramatically problematic in these countries. It affects the democratic will of the people within them, and it affects the ability of them to govern effectively. We think that when you're able to buy patronage in this way and affect a dramatic role in that, you're absolutely culpable in that, and we find it very difficult to deal with. We say that in difficult decisions, ladies and gentlemen, effectively what you're doing is you're allowing them to put them on hold. Very often, many countries need to develop economically by making tough economic decisions because they're too protectorate at the moment. If we give them cash for this, structurally, their economic incentives to change the role doesn't change. So the long-term stability and change that they need to integrate properly into the global system and become fully autonomous is retarded by this proposition. We find that dramatically problematic, and they will continue to be patronised states of ours, and that is very difficult for them to deal with. And we think they need to deal with this. We say that like patronage of the rich daddies, ladies and gentlemen, which are the United States or Japan, will continue the patronage going into the countries themselves and allow the elites to buy up votes. We think that that's very problematic. Now let's look at the positive case. No, thank you. Let's look at the positive case, ladies and gentlemen. Well, first of all, I've already told you in an opening rebuttal that we think everyone has a say in the resources of the earth and everybody should. No thanks. We think buying off people's votes says that their interests aren't as important as ours. It also says that you don't have a role anymore to play in biodiversity or in having consideration for the dignity of Wales, ladies and gentlemen. And we find this abhorrent. But further, we think that the positive case for sovereignty and dignity is great, ladies and gentlemen. We think that these countries have fought for independence very often from colonial masters. We think that what they've done is try to reach out to the world and be just as important as every other country. We think what you will do with their proposition is simply undermine the dignity and the respect and the sovereignty that they fought for. The independence that they've achieved, the autonomy that they fought for, will be totally undermined by this proposition. We think that, yes, it's difficult to counter China's influence, and yes, we recognise that that's a problem, but we don't think we should shift our international norms away from one nation, one vote, simply because it's a corrupting force. We think we should reinforce it, and we should do what we can to combat it, in order for these countries to move on and their sovereignty to be recognised. For them to make the structural changes they need to make within their countries, they need to keep a level of autonomous power. Ladies and gentlemen, we've told you how money for influence is banned, we've told you the negative effects in these countries which will now be culpable of, and we've told you the positive case for sovereignty. Do not vote for this proposition. This is a proposition of bribery and corruption, and we stand very firm in opposition. Thank you very much.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition and now invite up the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the round.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the Wales would be a little bit offended to think that this isn't a particularly important issue in international issues. But the reality is that we did talk about this as a principled debate, and the very clear principles that we told you is, firstly, that democracy is not appropriate in these forums, because the assertion that all interests are equal here is a false one. The second thing we told you is that this occurs already, and that this is actually skewing any idea of sovereignty, any idea of autonomy, any idea of competition in a genuine and fair way, because some countries have disproportionate influence. And he said, we went in response to a point of information where I asked him to actually explain for the first time how we would counter that influence. He said, well, we can do it in other ways, like maybe we'll give them a no strings attached aid package that just happens to coincide with the time of the vote and following on from China's aid package there. I think they can probably work out, even Wales supporters, that those things might actually be very similar to what we're proposing on the opening government. I want to look at 3 points of rebuttal. I firstly want to tackle this idea of the democratic principle of these institutions and whether this is appropriate anymore. I secondly want to ask the really important question, are all interests equal in international communities? And I finally want to look at the idea about how this undermines sovereignty, how this undermines the expertise in these bought-off countries, before going on to look at some content for how this incentivises countries to join international organisations at the moment where they're reluctant to because they're worried that they're going to be beholden in a non-democratic environment. So let's ask the question about the democratic principle. They said we need to fight for an ideal and that this is democratic, ignoring Victor's analysis about how this is actually anti-democratic, about how this proposal that we have at opening government aligns with existing policies that we find in our own democracies, in our own backyards. An example is how an individual is allowed to give money to a politician to allow that politician to advocate and further their particular interests, how individuals are allowed to consolidate their votes in lots of different organisations in order to vote as a bloc there, how individuals are allowed to contribute to unions, or unions have preference positions on particular committees because we recognise unions have a particular interest above other groups there. We think this actually aligns with those democratic principles, and even if it didn't, we need to be realistic. Realpolitik is the way to go, Mr. Speaker. It's happening already, and it is the most appropriate thing. And it's the most appropriate thing for the second thing that I want to look at here, the idea of equal interest. He said all of humanity has an interest in the whales, but he scoffed at the whales, and we think his scoffing actually betrays what lots of people in the international community really do think about the whales, which is sad and unfortunate and quite offensive to those nice big mammals. What we actually think is that interest is relative. Everyone has an abstract interest in biodiversity. That was never going to be contentious in today's debate, but it's about how much the effect of biodiversity in the sea affects a country like Australia or a country like Japan as distinct to a landlocked country like Kazakhstan. We think that maybe countries that are actually touching the sea have greater influence and greater effects there. We also think that countries are put off by the idea that some countries can hold them ransom when they don't actually have anything to do with these particular effects. And I'll look at later on about how that serves as a disincentive to truly participate and join international organisations there. Let's look at this final idea that we heard from him, which is the main body of his speech about how this ruins these countries that are bought off here. Firstly, he told us that in the short term, they'll make bad decisions. Well, firstly, we told you that this occurs now, and it occurs in a more rampant way because there is no competition, because these countries are missing out on the opportunity to have different countries effectively bid for their vote and to effectively give them more money than they would otherwise have. Victor told you that these countries were perfectly within their rights, and it was their prerogative to be able to do this. And if you truly believed in the idea of sovereignty and the idea of autonomous governments making decisions, then you actually align with the principle that these governments, which we trust to make short-term decisions all the time, that already make short-term decisions, should be able to make this one here. And then he told us the idea that this will be a massive loss of expertise because they can't talk anymore. Well, firstly, we think that you can still attend the party even if you have to attend the party with someone else. So that's just a massive overstated harm in today's debate. Even if we accept it, we think it's a negligible harm because this is particular to certain types of conventions that relate to you. So if you don't develop high-tech whaling negotiation skills when you're landlocked, we're okay with that because you might develop them in other formats like climate change negotiations. We also think that they probably will have more money to attend these types of conferences, more expertise and interest, because countries are now actively lobbying and attempting to inform them of the various issues that surround this particular problem because they have to win them over to their side. Yes, closing.
Can you please tell me how and why international laws are enforced?
International laws are enforced by consensus, and this leads very nicely to my substantive matter in today's debate, that is about participation and about engagement. And the fact that international law is something that is based upon consensus, and your desire to consent to that particular thing, is a particularly relevant issue for countries when considering how much they want to participate in a group and whether they want to actually join that group. And when you send the message and when countries believe that they don't have an equal and fair playing field to participate in, then that serves as a disincentive to join those particular things. So I want to look at two things in this point. I want to look at the idea of joining organisations, and I want to look at the idea of participation once you're there. Because at the moment there is increasing dissatisfaction with international relations. And they might be idealistic, but the vast majority of people in the world are realistic. What Victor told you is that there is disproportionate influence at the moment because of vote buying. And the idea that we can counter this in some other way is just rubbish if we accept their analysis that governments are ultimately short-term interest and will always take money over any type of altruistic ideal idea that you might think they have here. And this is particularly damaging because, like that point alluded to, you need support and you need the idea of an even playing field in these types of organisations. So let's look at the idea of joining. Because you're bound by international law where you opt into that particular system, and you can't enforce it on other people who don't consent to it, except for a few customary law exceptions there. And when there's disproportionate influence, firstly from countries like China and Japan that buy votes, when there's disproportionate influence from countries that are not as affected as you are, for example, Japan buying the votes of Iran, which is almost an exclusively landlocked country, we think that that sends the message to countries that there isn't as much of a point of joining these organisations in the first place, because you're beholden to people that don't have genuine interests or care about this particular policy at heart. Another good example is Micronesia, who is left out to dry in the context of climate change negotiations. We think that this actually creates the environment in which less powerful countries, in a vote sense, can disproportionately inflate their particular influence there, where it affects them more than other countries. And let's look at this idea of participation once you're there, because they want to envision an idea where the West has to counter-lobby the presence of large amounts of money from countries like China and Japan. We firstly think that's a massive waste of time, because ultimately the second thing we think is that you can't compete with those bottom dollars if we accepted their analysis of their short-term interests here. Mr. Speaker, we told you that we needed to be realistic about international politics. We told you that the idea of absolute democracy is inappropriate in this environment, and we also told you that this policy is not only good for these countries that are bought and get massive money that they wouldn't otherwise have, but it's also good in terms of the long-term participation and willingness to engage in international relations. We are proud to propose.
thank the Deputy Prime Minister and now invite us the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to deliver the next speech.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. The first thing I'd like to do in rebuttal is look at this contention that this already happens and that in actual fact it's negatively selected for because only the worst countries do it, and we'll deal with that. Secondly, I'd like to look at this contention that only those unaffected will sell and those that are affected have a right to exercise extra influence, and I want to look at that as well. The third thing I want to do and to dwell on and to develop more for our side is a substantive reason why it is not a moral choice, and this would be directly in rebuttal to the first proposition's Prime Minister, why it's not a moral choice to trade aid for influence, or to give up your influence for aid. We say the key determiner of the currently broken international system that has left so many people in poverty is that the rules are bent, the rules are fixed, and shuttling some money around will also be dwarfed by the effect of the fixed world trade system. So let's get straight into this rebuttal that it already happens. Oh yeah, and also we do it at home, because I can contribute to a political party. The analogy here you're looking for would be that the rich should be able to buy the poor's votes. Because, I mean, to be honest, let's go even further. They rarely, if ever, even use them. We say that absolutely, in cases of system, or even in domestic politics, individuals, politicians, tend to canvass only the opinions of the rich and well-off, already because they know that they vote. There's a perception. What you do when you enshrine this is the same thing you would do if you did this locally, which is take a perception that the poor have whether they're poor individuals at home or poor nations in the world system, that they don't matter and they can shape things, and you absolutely stick a normative badge all over it and say that is completely the way. It removes, undermines, takes the steam out of all your efforts to address that lack of influence by the poor, which is often a sort of self-inflicted lack of interest because they feel that they do not have a say. That only the worst rich countries do this. Well, this is the point. There are many things that, for instance, we may have used to, the moral rich countries may have done, but we've alienated. For instance, look at the fact that wielding enormous nuclear power influence would seem to be in itself something good, right? We see many countries seeking to illegitimately, for instance, develop nuclear technology. No thanks. And yet, Russia and the US have forged ahead in reducing their nuclear stockpiles by 80%. I mean, basically unilaterally, whilst also trying to draw people into an international framework. There are many things we've alienated, even though it seems like by doing so we've given disproportionate levels of power to other individuals. And this is the thing. There is a normative effect to our actions internationally, no thank you. And shaming and ability to speak from moral high ground has an ability in these international organisations, which is given up under this proposition. Secondly, that only those unaffected will sell their votes is not true. Actually, this selects for those individuals who are most desperate for aid and most in need of it, and least able at the moment to exercise influence in another way, and least able to have any solidarity with other members of a group. They're the ones, as opposed to those who are unaffected. Let's look at those affected should be given more influence. Think of global warming. I'll take closing in a second. Think of global warming. There are two effects of global warming. One, when global warming creates environmental effects like rising sea levels and increased number of natural disasters, it tends to disproportionately affect people in places like Bangladesh that are geographically susceptible to it, or those specific islands that are this close to being eliminated altogether, but also the poorest, or at least able to provide defences from it. There's a second effect, economically. The richest nations which produce the most CO2 will be the most relatively economically hurt by this, by any measures you take to reduce CO2 consumption. Those affected most, in this case, who can do something about it, are those that have the money. In other words, it's the US and China. They're the most affected, so they take out the pocketbook and they start spending. And they do it, and they create an effect whereby their interests, that is, seeking to mitigate the amount of CO2 they'll have to produce and keep their economies going as strong as they want, and not have to suffer any consequences of reduction in economic output for the sake of humanity, is they're vindicating their position. Those that aren't vindicated are the ones who are bought off, the ones who are going to be most affected by the negative consequences of continued global warming, which will be increased natural disasters and flooding in low-lying areas. I'll take you.
My question to you is this. Nations in the bottom billion lose their stature and their supposed sovereignty under your line in the House through what? Either being able to have a commodity with which they gain respect and sell their vote, or counting out pittances and begging for aid from NGOs. Which one better serves them?
Or being able to be a part of the 130 members of the misappropriately named G77 of the UN General Assembly, which now holds a majority there and still controls aspects of, for instance, and is able to go into genuine contention with the UN Security Council about how we should deal with global warming and how we should, and whether or not the UN Security Council should have the ability to, for instance, take terrorism, dealing with terrorism under its remit. We see the increased influence there at the UN Security Council, and say that's some way that they're able to exercise influence. In terms of aid for influence and moral choice, no thank you. We say letting others set the rules by basically letting them buy the right to make a decision as to what the rules should be, and then accepting their largesse and their strings attached loans, which often go back to paying their corporations to do things in our countries, all right, which doesn't enshrines the fixed system. At the moment, no thanks. At the moment, no matter how much money we're pouring into these countries in aid, it will always be a drop in the ocean compared to international trade systems. Free trade is not fair trade, and at the moment, starting from a position of unfair competition, the ability to rapaciously extract the minerals of these nations, amongst other things that they do down there, our corporations, with our sponsorship, operate in an environment that has been fixed from the start against the poorest and the least influential. But it's like that old analogy: give me a fish, you feed me for a day; teach me to fish, you feed me for life. This enshrining of the rules, creating a broke system, in 1 second, Fiona. This creating of a broke system fundamentally will create about 100 times, a beast that's 100 times bigger than any amount of aid we give to people. As you say, it's never been more than 0.2% of GDP that's been given in aid, and this is more aid package, so it will be of that order of magnitude. Whereas world trade is about 100 times larger, and that's what needs to be fixed. But this is exactly where people are losing influence. If you want to, for instance, look at the stalled round of Doha trade talks, which might be broken in deadlock if we were, for instance, able to buy off those like India and China don't like, yes.
We love free trade too, but those things have stalled. What hasn't stalled is the ability to put food and aid into mouths of people who don't have it otherwise.
Well, you see, the reason why, for instance, the World Trade Talks, WTO talks, the Doha round, which by the way has a provision if there is a continued deadlock for a one country one vote policy, whereby you don't need to get everyone on board, but just enough. I mean, which means that you could buy off these poor countries. The point is, at the moment, the EU and the US have entirely selfish protectionism for the well-off farmers, which is one of the agricultural subsidies there, one of the key things that's stalling. What's going to happen under their paradigm is that to get that round, which has been stalled for 9 years or 10 years now, underway again, the rich countries like the US and the EU can take out the checkbook and can buy the votes of some small enough countries where it doesn't take a lot of aid to impress them, and thereby be able to get a system where they don't have to give any concessions on agricultural subsidies, but they can open up by lowering of tariffs smaller, more vulnerable countries for their companies to come into, and for their farmers, for instance, to dump excess production of agricultural goods into, which may absolutely eradicate the native agricultural industry there. That's precisely the kind of thing where we see these being most influential, and that's precisely the kind of thing where we say that's very harmful to basic homes.
I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition and now invite up the Member of Government to continue the round.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, I find it rather odd the opposition tells us there's a broken system, we need to reform it, and then tell you there's no way we can actually fix it in the same breath. They tell you that countries only act in their short-term interests when it comes to money and completely ignore their long-term gains. I find this, first of all, to be offensive when it comes to the diplomatic efforts of those nations and decisions they make. I think they're probably capable of making their own decisions for long-term interests as well. But more importantly, ignorant of the entire debate thus far that actually considers the reality of what the situation is in today's debate. We congratulate our outwarding for talking about the idea that we need this for competition, but what Ivy and I are going to bring to you in today's debate is specifically how this empowers those smaller nations. We don't believe this actually undermines any of their own interests, but rather better represents them and puts them in a better state of being overall. I'm going to prove this to you in 3 points. First, I'm going to talk exactly about how this represents their interests. I think this will clash very nicely with what opening has brought us on this side of the bench. Then, I'm going to talk about how this creates better diplomacy for those nations, and lastly, how it prevents any sort of regional backlash we see happening in the current system. Before I do that, I'm going to do a couple points of rebuttal, and I'll be brief, I promise. So now let's talk about this idea we get that buying votes in general is a bad thing. They give you the analogy of those who are really poor in the US have been allowed to be bought out by the Rockefellers of the world. Well, I tell you one, this already happens in advertising. I think that's good to know. But more importantly, when you give a poor person something that says your vote is actually worth value to me, there's 2 outcomes this can have. Either they sell it without thinking, which we think is fine because if you're apathetic, then so be it. Or they ask themselves and they question, why do you want my vote? Why are you willing to give me millions of dollars to buy off my ability to affect global climate change? In this regard, we think that's actually an incentive for these nations or the poor people in a democracy to consider the issues at play and why that vote has so much substantial value that they're willing to simply sell it off, and therefore creates more engagement engagement we've seen ever before, and that's a good outcome too. Because in either situation, some who are apathetic, we will lose. They don't show up to international meetings that don't affect them. They don't partake in the discussion or the debate. But if their value is suddenly given something they saw to be lackluster in the first place, they now have an incentive to actually engage in that diplomacy effort and choose whether or not to buy it or to sell it. That in itself is empowering to these nations in diplomatic arenas. We think that's a good thing. Before I get into my substantive, go ahead, sir.
You're absolutely wrong about this. The few things nations have in one nation, one vote systems is their influence. These little countries are desperate to be heard. And the point is, they are no longer necessary to be talked to in informal meetings because you can talk to the patron state.
Sir, they are so desperate that regimes are turning to China to give them aid, allowing them to extract their resources without any monetary gain and stability for those nations. That is the desperation your status quo creates that we try to counteract. Because we provide for this model, we give them a choice. They don't have to sell off their interests. They simply now have multiple buyers who reflect multiple interests that they can choose to side with. That gets into my first point. Why does this better represent their interests? Because we believe interest is a scale, and I'm talking about three specific groups here. First, those who don't care, who will either sell them with apathy and don't affect the vote in the first place anyway, or those who suddenly start to question why it is their vote has value and engage in the debate. We think that ultimately is a better outcome. Then there are those who have a moderate interest, who aren't really sure if it's worth selling or worth not selling. What we'd say, though, is these nations have to prioritize their global agendas. They have severe problems with poverty in their nations, they have food crises, and if their priority is to provide for their people economically, we think they should be able to sell off their other interests in order to do so. We think meeting those goals are actually a priority for them that we should have to recognize on the side of the bench, because right now all they have to turn to are those economic powers who would choose to put strings on them in their aid. Then we think there are those who have a very strong interest in doing so, which the opposition tells you are going to be undermined by this motion because they'll be forced to take the money. We say absolutely not. Why? Because when you have individuals in a nation who are angry at the leader for voting against their interests, that leader is ousted and they are accountable to their government. We think that in itself puts a good check against those diplomats from engaging in policy that's not going to affect them in a positive light. We think all three interest groups are better provided for under our model. But furthermore, we think this actually creates better diplomacy overall. We think this does it in terms of transparency as well as accountability. First, to transparency. When we talk about the system and the status quo, opposition has conveniently ignored the fact that this already takes place, as our colleague has mentioned. And what happens as a result of that? Well, for one, the international community can't condemn Zimbabwe for accepting aid from China because no one else has offered to give it to them. But more importantly, we don't know exactly what strings can be attached with that policy. We can't tell if Zimbabwe is siding with us to gain something in the end, or they're siding with China because they actually have an interest in the issue, or because China gave them more guns to prop up the Mugabe regime. We don't know. When we allow for this motion to pass, we create a transparent process that tells exactly what their interests are and allows us to better cater to those interests for our own well-being as well. But also for the people. The people in that nation, I'll get to back up in a moment, now understand exactly why the diplomats act in the way they do, and are better able to create better government and better revolutions or better support for their government because they see the political game that is now being played in those backroom chats opposition would rather support. Go ahead, sir.
Would you allow rich people in domestic politics to buy the votes of poor people, and if not, why not?
Absolutely. At the point where 80% of America doesn't even engage in the political realm, we think offering them the ability to sell their vote stands a far better chance of either getting them to vote or having a better outcome in those elections. We think at the point where money already buys advertising the same way aid already buys votes in the UN, sure, we would gladly fight that in our in the House. Now let's talk about accountability, because we think there's a strong argument to be made that those who make decisions for their governments are ultimately held accountable to their people. And in this regard, diplomats now have to consider more heavily what is in the best interest of their nation, because those at home can see who bought their vote and not actually allowed the vote to be cast. We think this is empowering for citizenry as a whole and better off for those individuals to actually affect their government, because there's a clear line of accountability that says, I don't want you to engage in behavior of China because that was directly against global climate change that was going to sink my village back at home. We think this is empowering. But more importantly, we think this prevents regional gridlock, our last point in today's debate. Because look at those nations who don't see themselves aligned with anyone. The non-aligned movement, for example. Over 100 countries who see themselves as independent of any actual voting bloc. But they're not able to actually voice their vote. Why? Because nations like Nepal and Ghana fear repercussions from those regional powers they see in their nations. Like Honduras, who's afraid to vote against Venezuela. So even if they had an interest, they're not likely to cast a vote for themselves, but for those regional powers. What this enables them to do is sell their vote to a power who represents their interests, because in a world with economic parity, there will be 2 buyers, there will be 3 buyers, and many interests to be represented. We think in this regard, they're better able to prevent that regional backlash for themselves and still have their interests at heart. Ladies and gentlemen, gentlemen, when we consider how this actually affects those small nations opposition tells you we harm, we see it's actually empowering. Why? Because everyone who has an interest, small or large, is benefited, because it allows for more accountability and diplomacy, and because we prevent any sort of gridlock that has enabled us from creating real policy changes like climate change or any sort of consensus in international bodies. We better the system, we support those nations they claim to be victimized, we are proud.
I thank the member of government and now call upon the member of opposition to continue the round.
Mr. Speaker, we have 3 points of extension. First of all, we're going to talk about diplomatic relations, in particular the diplomatic relations which exist between the power players on the world stage, how this motion negatively affects their interaction in the world as a whole. Secondly, we're going to talk about what happens when you allow poor countries to sell their votes, how it's bad for poor countries and how it's ultimately, again, bad for the interaction on a global scale. And then finally, we're going to tackle the idea of international organisations, because the proposition teams have predicated a lot of their case on why these are good things to have, and we're going to show how ultimately this motion damages these good things. But first of all, I have 3 points of the ball. Firstly, what we've had from opening government is the idea that this motion allows the people most affected to have the most say on their issues. We think that this only holds true if those people are, not coincidentally, the most wealthy countries. We think that this doesn't take into account the fact that the poorest countries in the world are sometimes the most affected by issues, and that this motion gives them no way of redress. Secondly, we have the idea that poorest countries won't always sell their votes. And so we say that sometimes the short-term need can be more pressing, no thank you, not yet, than any kind of long-term idea. We think that this is massively coercive. We say that when your people are dying for want of sufficient healthcare, for want of sufficient education, we think sometimes you'll vote for the development package and ignore the fact that all the whales are going to die. No thank you. Thirdly, we want to talk about the idea that just came out of closing government, their extension, which is that this is empowering, no thank you, for people of poorer nations. We say, first of all, it's simply a fact that often in developing nations, democracy is quite imperfect, and that consequently the people in these nations aren't necessarily able to make their voice heard by their politicians. But we also say that, again, they have much more pressing short-term needs, like the ability to feed and educate their children. No thank you. And we say they're often ignorant even of the long-term consequences of their vote. So we don't think that this is going to really empower them to make the wisest decisions. No thank you. But now I want to talk about this idea of diplomatic relations. Like, the world that is envisaged under their policy is one of power players scrapping for votes. The USSR, China, the USA, not interacting with each other, but trying to get the poorer countries to agree to sell their votes to them. We say that when they can just buy votes, no thank you, when they can buy the outcome that they want, why do they have to interact with each other? We say that in this situation, no thank you, there's much less need for them to negotiate with one another when they can simply try to outspend each other. We think that this leads to, no thank you, a more fractured international community where power players can set themselves against each other without needing necessarily to interact with each other. We think that bad things happen when there are no negotiations. We think that bad things happen when people don't have an incentive to enter into them. We think, no thank you, that there are unequivocal and extremely stark outcomes, because we think that the good thing that comes from negotiation is compromise. You get something you want, I get something I want, and the two things that we both think are the worst possible consequences don't happen. We don't think that this happens, no thank you, under this model, when one person can simply buy the black and out outcome that they want and ignore the other players in the international scene. No thank you. But we also say that this leads to other problems, such as the fact that in dire times they can't really turn to each other anymore, because no trust exists. No trust exists because no relationship exists, because is now predicated on money. No thank you. And who can spend the most? Not on a long-term relationship built up through negotiation, interaction, concessions, no thank you, and compromise. We think this, no thank you, not yet, leads to much greater isolationism. And we think that this, in turn, when there are no ties binding these countries to each other, this leads to a much more volatile environment. No thank you. We say that the relationships between countries act as a stabilising tie, act as a check, because they know that they have something to lose. We say that this is destroyed when you can substitute money, no thank you, for the build-up of diplomatic relationships, which is why we oppose this motion. But now I want to talk about the votes of poorer countries, why we don't think that they should be allowed to sell them.
We say that what they brought you in closing government is the idea that this says your vote has value. We say this stops people from thinking my vote has value as a vote. This makes people think my vote has value as a commodity. No thank you. We think this is dangerous. No thank you. We think this affects how developed countries view developing countries. Because they can say, well, we offered them the money, we didn't make them take it, therefore they don't really care about this as much as we care about this. It means they can discount, no thank you, what the votes of developing nations, even when they vote for reasons which aren't pecuniary. No thank you. And we think that actually, even though you're just offering it to them, you're not making them take it, it's actually hugely coercive. Because as we have said, they have sorts of short-term, no thank you, and pressing needs that make it completely understandable that they would have to accept this package and ignore the long-term, no thank you, for the moment. We say that this reinforces all the problems that they've talked about, a lack of democracy on an international scale. And we also think, no thank you, it continues to entrench division. But we think that poor countries are never going to be in a position to reverse this. That's one of our major problems with this model. We say their issues are inevitably going to be overlooked, no thank you, or voted against, because they simply aren't going to ever have the funding, no thank you, to buy the votes that we need. And we would like to point out to you, because we think it's hugely significant, that the interests, no thank you, of developing nations and developed nations don't always coincide. And we give examples of things like no thank you and carbon taxes and taxes on carbon emissions, but also trade protectionism. No thank you. We think it's extremely important that richer countries shouldn't be able to travel roughshod on over these people. No thank you. What we've also had from them is the idea that when they want to create, no thank you, an equal and fair playing field, and they think that this kind of thing is what's going to incentivize people to join international organisations. No thank you. We say people won't want to join an international organisation. No thank you, where all the power is simply given to the richest people. Now I want to talk really quickly about international organisations. We say first of all, there is no world police. People don't join these organisations because they're coerced into it. They join them because they want to. And we say that from this will to join derives the legitimacy for the power to be able to act as a collective. We think that we don't think that this idea should be abandoned, because this idea is that which allows us to enforce things like international law, like the law of the sea. We say, why would people listen to these groups if they acknowledge the fact that they are no longer founded on moral legitimacy, but are instead founded on the fact that people can simply sell their votes? We think that under this model, international organisations stop being democracies, but instead become oligarchies and plutocracies. We say that there is no longer any incentive for people to listen to these groups when they are no longer founded on moral reasons, but are simply founded on financial strength. We also think that this means when you don't have to listen to them, you can even oppose them. And we think that this is even worse when you can characterise things like the UN as being the product of decadent Western nations. We say that their cases were based on the idea of these being worthwhile organisations. Agreeing with them on this, we don't think you should weaken the only power that these organisations have, which is moral.
I thank the member of opposition and invite up the government whip to close out the round from his side.
Mr. Speaker, I know that we can try to claim moral high ground having gone through the accommodations that we had the last week and saying that we might have a relationship on par with developing and poor nations. Not. But what we would say from our opposing colleagues over here is, far be it from the reality, their idea that you have only a moral stance left to take for these developing nations in terms of their votes and the commodification of that vote flies in the face of the reality that we have to you on side proposition. What is that reality? We have to understand that international organizations right now have an asymmetric framework whereby the most powerful nations can utilize that framework for further exploitation, where you have a lack of transparency in the strings attached process of aid that Amy brought to you. What is everything that we got out of the side opposition today? We have to strive for the ideal. How dare you think in the short term rather than the long term? Mind you, Mr. Speaker, that we have an interesting tension between the member of opposition and her opening team. She says that, look, people are dying. In the short term there's famines. In the short term there's problems. We can't look to these structural problems, to which we say, exactly, the priorities that we have on developing nations are completely in conflict with what you would like to see. What do Burkina Faso and other states where you have famine and you have a lack of clean water want? Short-term interests. Why? Because when you have people that can't live past the age of 5, global climate change seems a little bit abstract to them, and they like to take care of their people as well. What am I going to do with you in summation of today's round? I'm going to ask 2 questions. Does the democratic one vote, one nation even exist? And if so, is it a good thing with these international organizations? And second, are poor nations actually harmed or helped? We say that they are tremendously helped. But before I get into that, let's listen to what we heard from the member of opposition. She tells us, among other things, that you can't possibly do this because then international relations becomes only a subject of money. Right. Because the oil for food program in the UN had absolutely nothing to do with money, because buying off diplomats has absolutely nothing to do with money, because every single controversy that you have in an IR round motion has to do with aid packages from developed countries to poorer countries and leads to proxy wars. Sure, guys, you're going to make this even worse. We say that you actually get a benefit. And what's that benefit? You actually enable state sovereignty. Why? Because we think that the basis of state sovereignty and the basis of these developing nations to be able to have a say in terms of being legitimate is the ability to take care of their citizens. If their ability to sell off votes, to actually have the ability not to be one voice screaming in the UN General Assembly, actually allows powerful countries to come to them as a sign of patronage, not at this time, thank you. We say you bring home wells, you clean water, you build roads, you do the short-term things that actually help your people. God help us that we get that. But then what do we also get from the member of government as well? She says that diplomacy is not going to exist anymore because it's going to become these battleground fields, to which we say, thank you opening up for bringing up the START Treaty that was completely bilateral. We say you still have diplomatic channels. We say that the diplomatic corps of countries don't just shuttle off and go home because you can now buy votes in certain areas. You still need to require these diplomatic channels at the same time. That's not at all affected on their side of the house. But what does she also tell you? She tells you this interesting story of how developed countries are going to now look down with disdain on developing countries because they didn't sell off their vote. To which we say, look at everything government just told you about today. One of two things happens. Either they don't sell off their vote, in which case they might look principled, you might actually garner some international attention, or you actually do finally sell off your vote in that case because you're actually vetting your buyers. Why? Because of the simple economic principle of scarcity. If that was the absolute case, why is it that you still pander for votes in the status quo? Finally, what we get from her is this idea that international relationships do not predicate themselves on monetary contribution. That's a bad thing. Anyone ever heard of the IMF? Anybody ever heard of the fact that that's proportionate to your contributions? And why is there still an increase in contributions? Why is there still an increase in people attempting to get into there? We see that that recognizes the reality.
Okay.
Before I get into my first question, is democracy, this one vote for one nation, a good thing? Yes, sir.
Okay, here's an interesting thing.
Okay.
Are the prop happy to prop up non-democratic regimes with this kind of money when you don't know if they have the interests of their citizens in mind or the long-term or short-term interests other than the patronage and their own government?
The question is, what do you do about that? Because under your system, your strings are less transparent under here as well. Look at exactly what Amy told you. Under the status quo, you had your chance, thank you. What you get is Robert Mugabe being able to get an aid package that nobody can see. If Mugabe's representative is able, therefore, to have a critical vote when it comes to peacekeeping troops in Darfur or wherever you have him, guess what? People are going to wonder why so many millions are coming out of Beijing or coming out of DC. That might send red flags there rather than cranes of a different nationality being outside the streets of Harare. We think that's a significant benefit on our side of the house. So why is the one vote, one nation actually a bad thing? Because as opening up told you, it's inherently unequal. Why is it inherently unequal? Because you have to assume inequality by the rules. And the fact of the matter is that everything that we've given you in terms of analysis flies in the face of that. The ability for you right now, for instance, to be able to have organizations, whether they be about saving the whales, whether they be the OAS trying to kick out Honduras or not, all have the ability of larger states being able to knock over and bulldoze smaller nations. Why has that actually changed then on our side of the house? Because in the status quo, where you have states that have to rely on specific aid from the United States, for example, and they have to say we have to kick out Honduras, as Amy told you, you're actually empowering them. Why? Because other actors can infuse that money for that vote in a particular nation state. So all of a sudden, Guatemala has an absolute best interest to vote against throwing out Honduras from the OAS. You actually get efficacy on our side of the house. No, thank you. But as we also told you, the democracy of one vote also undermines it because you lack any accountability mechanism whatsoever. When you look at countries like Burkina Faso, and you look at smaller nation states like Micronesia, they are not at all being brought up mostly in the Copenhagen or the Cancun climate change. Who's your big players? Your Al Gore's of the world, who's not even a really president. No, thank you very much. And what you have instead is the ability for the big players to utilize the veneer of consensus to be able to railroad through any legislation. In that veneer, a lot is lost. So the second question I have for you, which is how are poor nations harmed or helped? And it's important to understand, Mr. Speaker, that all of Amy's analysis of these benefits never got once addressed by the member of the opposition. And what did she actually tell you about? That yes, though democracies might have some imperfections, these developing nations, you actually have to take care of them in the short term. And when you look at these short-term interests that are the immediate, most pressing interests, because guess what? Unlike the developed world, those short-term interests are existential interests to the state. That's actually better helped on our side of the house. But you also have accountability, because yes, you do see change. If we want to bring up Zimbabwe, you have the MDC, you have the power sharing agreement. People want to know who you're selling your vote off to. That's a net benefit on our side of the house. But what you also get is this regional cooperation and this regional interest. States which previously felt apathetic now have an ability to say, yes, my vote was for all intents and purposes already a commodity. Now that it's out there in the open as a commodity, now that I actually have a say with which my country can better itself, I actually have a market. And a market brings competitors, and competitors takes care of my people. At the end of the day, what is it we care about in closing government? Helping the poorest people with the most immediate proximity to harm. If they want to live in the ideal world and ignore realpolitik, they better give us a hell of a better burden than saying it's moral. Because guess what? I want to save poor kids. I don't want them to die from cholera. That's moral. We propose.
Thank the government whip, and now invite the opposition whip to close out the round.
Mr. Speaker, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, today I have 3 points of clash. I'm going to look at voting power, I'm going to look at the legitimacy of doing this, and I'm going to look at the effect on international relationship and the clash that's come up in the debate on these issues. But before I do, I have 2 points of refutation. Okay, they told us about China and whaling, how this is already a massive issue. But as far as I'm aware, whaling is still illegal in the world because they still haven't worked. China doesn't have the influence they want to have at the moment by buying votes. Buying votes has generally failed, and even if it hasn't, the way to stop China and Japan buying votes and a race to the bottom isn't to join them, it's to beat them, ladies and gentlemen. It's like saying the way to stop corruption in a country is to be the most corrupt person, and then nobody else will be corrupt. We don't buy it. Secondly, they told you we'll still have moral countries who don't sell their votes. We think this is true. What will happen to the countries who vote for what they believe is right is a massive collective action problem. No, thank you. When half the developed countries sign up for a trade deal that hurts them, the other half who stand for what they morally believe get left behind because they get neither the aid nor the vote that is in developed countries' interests. We think this creates a massive problem. Okay. First proposition stood up here on vote power. First proposition stood up here, and they told you that we have a problem. No, thank you. They told you that there was a vote weighting issue in the world at the moment. They said, they gave you the idea of how in the world, in countries, you get one vote, and so you can weight different issues differently, and that makes your weighting is important. And they said this didn't happen when you vote by issue. This is completely untrue when you look at how countries actually work in international politics. If you look at things like soft power, things like vote trading, like the fact that countries when they have strong beliefs, don't have those beliefs changed. An example of this is France and CAP, where France is willing to make negotiations and concessions to Britain that it doesn't really agree with in the EU, so long as things like the common agricultural policy stay in place. We say countries' fundamental issues are put forward under this model, and they are protected, and we think that vote weighting works. No, thank you. What they want to give you is what they claim is a system where vote weighting, where the countries who want it most will pay the most money. In a world where every country has the same amount of money to buy votes, I'll take you in a moment, that makes sense. But at the moment, some countries are significantly wealthier than others, and that gives those significantly wealthier countries significantly greater say in the world. We think they already have too much of a say in the world. This is a problem that doesn't help poor people, which is the burden they set on themselves. Opening.
Which one is it? Your point just then was that this hasn't had an effect in the IWC. Your point just then was that this is massively coercive. We told you the status quo is coercive now, and it's actually better for the third world to be able to capitalise on the status quo.
It doesn't work at the moment because not enough people do it. It's quite a small thing that's limited to China and like Japan on one issue, whaling, which as first opposition told you isn't exactly the issue of our time, and even if it was, they haven't managed to change the whaling laws. They've just made there be more of a debate. No, thank you. When you legitimise it, when you say that everybody can do this, then it becomes coercive. Then countries have to sell out or they get left behind. We think this creates a massive problem where poor countries do poorly. I asked in a point of information to you closing, would you allow poor people to sell their votes? And they said yes. What happens to the poor person who sells their vote for slightly more money than he uses in his welfare payments? He makes a slight gain, and every other poor person loses. They're not protecting the poor. They're not protecting the famine. And the way international politics works is we're not going to make a deal with every country. We're going to make a deal with enough countries, developed countries, where we get what we want, and they possibly be a race to the bottom with them. We don't think this is good. We don't think this helps the poor. We think you failed to reach your own burden. No, thank you. Legitimacy. Like they brushed aside, closing brushed aside this idea that Kate gave you of legitimacy in politics. But as she told you, there are no police in international politics. There is no course of actor, there's no way enforcing laws. Countries obey them because they see the value in obeying them, they see the moral value in them. And the whole place system is predicated on this. It's like the way you don't break the traffic light at 2 a.m. even though you know that you'll never get caught for it, because you see there's a reason for that traffic light to be there, you see it's important. No, thank you. The problem with this proposition is these laws lose their legitimacy. They lose, the reason countries follow them is because they're seen as right, and they lose their legitimacy, and they lose the way, okay, closing in a second, to keep countries in line, and that hurts the international relations, and that hurts international politics. Go.
So when there are multiple buyers in a world of economic parity, and a populace holding those government officials accountable, why are their interests then having to be compromised?
Sorry, can you say that again?
So when you have multiple buyers who offer different interests, why then does the government have to sacrifice its interest for itself?
Okay, because, right, at the moment, the rich countries generally vote as a bloc in things like Doha. You just have to look at the chins there. Like where China, Japan, and Japan, America and the EU negotiate together. We think they just have to buy enough poor countries to win over, to get the vote passed. We think that it is going to be in poor countries' interest to sell out because they know enough other poor countries will sell out. No, thank you. This places a potential problem and a race to the bottom, because worse to not sell your vote and have the vote passed than to sell your vote and have the vote passed, and you at least get a little bit of income. But either way, they lose by this being a choice. That was the point that Kate brought to you and that you ignored. No, thank you. But they lose a sense of legitimacy, and that's why things like are so important. Finally, the closing whip speaker ignored Kate's whole analysis on international relations and the fact that this has, because it'll divide nations, as she told you. It'll divide nations and countries when they have to bid for things, when they no longer work together over things, when it comes a race to the bottom. Because a big part of international relations is building relationships with other countries and working with other countries. You lose that when you buy things. Like, your friend isn't your friend if you pay him to hang around with you. We think the same is true of international relations, and it stops countries working together, which ultimately isn't in their long-term interest. We also lose things like countries' ability to have other countries help them out when they're not in a particularly strong place, because countries will now jump on the weak. And like, we lose the apathy in international politics, which has been so important in the past, which is so important when countries are desperate, and which stops countries working together. So for all those reasons, Mr. Speaker, it gives me the greatest pleasure to protect poor people and oppose this motion. Thank you.